visual hallucinations after sight loss, called Charles Bonnet Syndrome, or CBS for short. Esme's umbrella logo. Hello, my name is Judith Potts and I am the founder of Esme's Umbrella, which is the charity to raise awareness of a condition called Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Charles Bonnet Syndrome occurs when someone of any age has lost over 60% of sight. It causes vivid, silent, visual hallucinations, which range from disturbing to terrifying. It's very important to remember that this is not a mental health condition, but caused entirely by loss of sight. The kind of hallucinations which people experience can be very simple ones, like blobs of colour, patterns, grids, all the way through to animals, birds, insects, and people. When someone sees the image of a human being, that image is usually wearing a costume of some kind, military or medieval, Edwardian. My own mother, the Esme of Esme's Umbrella, saw an Edwardian street child who followed her everywhere. Now let me hand you over to Professor Dominic ffytche of King's College London. Professor ffytche is the world authority on Charles Bonnet Syndrome.
Thank you, Judith. So I'm Professor Dominic ffytche. I'm Professor of Visual Psychiatry at King's College London, and I run a specialist clinic for visual hallucinations and Charles Bonnet Syndrome here. So visual hallucinations, that's seeing something that's not really there, has lots of different causes, and when it's eye disease, that's where we reserve this term Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So you can get visual hallucinations in other conditions like Parkinson's disease. You can get them in a range of different types of dementias. But that's different to what we mean by Charles Bonnet Syndrome, where you are mentally absolutely intact, you've just got eye disease, and that's triggering the hallucinations. So one way of thinking about this is like phantom limbs that you may be familiar with, where you use a limb and you have the sense of the limb still being there. Well, it's like that in the visual system. So the brain cells are firing off when they shouldn't be, and they're giving you this illusion of something being out there in the world when it isn't really. And we know from brain scanning experiments that this is all to do with parts of the brain that we normally use for vision. So seeing colours or faces or objects in front of us, these bits are firing off, and when they do spontaneously, it gives you a sense of seeing a face or seeing a colour or seeing a pattern out there when there's actually nothing there. So it's important to realise that any eye condition can cause Charles Bonnet Syndrome, as long as it's causing a moderate degree of visual loss. And what I mean by that is, if you go to the opticians and you can't read sort of halfway down the chart, then you're at risk of having Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And you can think of it as a normal response of the brain to loss of visual input, and if you're a normal sighted person and you wear a blindfold for long enough, you'll start to have Charles Bonnet Syndrome hallucinations. An important message for us all is that there is treatment for Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and for many people that's just simple things like knowing about it, knowing that it's linked to your eye problem, and that chances are it's going to improve over time. It may not go away entirely. And then there are various tricks that people learn how to stop hallucinations when they're occurring. So that doesn't cure the Charles Bonnet Syndrome, but it gives you some control over it. So that could be eye movements, it could be changing the lighting or distracting yourself. The hallucinations tend to come when you're sort of sitting comfortably, not doing very much, not dozing off necessarily, but sort of not particularly active. And if you get up and do something to alert yourself, that can sometimes stop the hallucinations. But that, of course, is not enough for everyone. There is about a third of people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome who need more help. And there are various medications that can be tried to help Charles Bonnet Syndrome. They tend to differ for individuals, so some people a certain type of medication will work and it won't work for others. and they tend to all be aiming to reduce this excitability in the visual parts of your brain. So drugs that we use to treat epilepsy, for example, help Charles Bonnet syndrome. That doesn't mean to say you've got epilepsy, but the medication helps. And similarly, anti-dementia drugs, which act on a brain chemical that we use in vision, they can help Charles Bonnet syndrome, even if you haven't got dementia, nothing to do with dementia, but the medications can still help. And an important new type of approach is electrical treatment. And in fact, we've just published a study showing that if you use electrical stimulation on the back of your head where the visual parts of your brain are, that dampens down this activity, that can help reduce Charles Bonnet syndrome hallucinations without any of the side effects that you might get by taking medication. What research would we like to happen? We've had lots of surveys of Charles Bonnet syndrome. We know quite a lot now about the different types of hallucinations. We're getting a better sense of how common it is, so we don't really need that type of research at the moment. What we need quite urgently is treatment trials. So as I mentioned, a lot of this evidence that we have is based on a few people that tried a particular medication and it worked for them, but we don't really know across all of Charles Bonnet syndrome how that works and which is the best type of medication. So there's definitely a need for proper treatment trials where you've got a placebo drug that you're comparing it with, or comparing two different types of drugs to see which one is better. And in terms of understanding the brain mechanism behind Charles Bonnet syndrome, we know a lot about it, but the big thing that we don't know is why only some people get it. So a very important take-home message is that Charles Bonnet syndrome is essentially a normal response of the brain to visual loss. It hasn't got any wider implications about mental health issues or about early dementia in people of a certain age. It is important as well to know that the hallucinations tend to improve over time. We used to say that your hallucinations will all go away within 18 months, but unfortunately we now know that's not the case, that they last for much longer in most people, but that's not to say they're there at the same intensity. So it could be that when you start to have your hallucinations, you're having it all the time, every day, and then gradually you'll have a sort of an episode every week or so, and then every month, and it will gradually get shorter and shorter. So it's certainly not the case that the hallucinations will be there as a problem in the longer term. And it's also important to know that life stresses can flare up the hallucinations, lack of sleep, and sort of non-specific things like that can make your Charles Bonnet syndrome worse. So techniques that help avoid those sort of things or generally reduce stress can also help Charles Bonnet syndrome. Well, I hope this has been informative and that I've answered some of the questions about Charles Bonnet syndrome, and I'm going to hand back to Judith now.
Thank you, Dominic. And now we're going to hear from Professor Mariya Moosajee. Mariya is a consultant ophthalmologist at both Moorfields and Great Ormond Street hospitals, and she is going to talk about her work with children who develop CBS.
Thank you, Judith. My name is Professor Mariya Moosajee. I'm a consultant ophthalmologist based at Moorfields Eye Hospital and Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. I'm also a Professor of Molecular Ophthalmology, and I have a research lab at University College London and the Francis Crick Institute. So we've been undertaking quite a lot of research into Charles Bonnet syndrome in children, and we undertook a 9-year study at Moorfields, and we identified several children that were suffering from this. There was a mix in the type of hallucinations they were seeing. Some were seeing complex images, so these were distorted, scary faces, gargoyle-like images, animals such as spiders, and then others complained of the simplex images, so they just saw patterns and coloured dots. And some patients actually complained of seeing both types of images, so it can be quite variable. In terms of how those visual hallucinations made them feel, well, the main consensus was that it did cause stress, anxiety and fear. It's really difficult. It depends on their age. In young children, they may not be able to differentiate whether a hallucination is real or not real. And younger children sometimes have imaginary friends or pets. And so from an adult perspective, you don't know whether this is a visual hallucination or it's just your imagination. If it is scary, then obviously that can cause the stress and anxiety for them. But if it's just simple dots or patterns, it may not actually cause them any undue stress. But for those that are slightly older that can report seeing, for example, distorted faces, that actually led to a lot of stress in these patients. It affected their sleep, their social interactions. Some of these individuals actually had problems forming social relationships with friends at school. One individual actually ended up dropping out of university because they couldn't cope with the burden of their hallucinations. It affected their concentration and their ability to form relationships. There was one child that was particularly plagued with seeing spiders on their pillow at night, and so it really disturbed them at night, and it was a real trauma for the patient and the family to get to sleep, to the point that the child did not want to actually be in that room at night because they were so scared. And another patient reported seeing insects crawling on their food and ended up developing an eating disorder. The other important thing to bear in mind is that certainly in teenagers, they might actually start to think that they're developing mental health problems and schizophrenia, whereas in the adult population and elderly, they're more worried about dementia. And so this is the reason it's so important to talk to our patients about this in advance so that they know that this is not a mental health condition and it can be dealt with easy coping mechanisms in most cases. Interestingly, most children said that they would not tell their friends about Charles Bonnet syndrome or their visual hallucinations. Now, this is also dependent on the age of the child and the child's personality themselves. In general, from my experience working with children, most children who have a degree of sight loss but are in normal schooling usually don't even share with their peers that they have a sight loss disorder, and sometimes they don't share it with their teachers. And so if they're not willing to share that, then usually they would probably be unlikely to share the fact that they're seeing things because they'd be scared of what their peers may think about them. But then there are children who have quite severe sight loss and may have support at school already, and so may feel a bit more comfortable sharing their experiences because they have the support around them and their encouragement. But in general, I would say this is not an area that children would feel comfortable talking about freely. I think the reason that this condition has really gone unrecognised in children for so long is twofold. One, anecdotally, we know that we as healthcare professionals have not been good at asking parents and children about whether they're suffering from visual hallucinations or even mentioning Charles Bonnet syndrome. And that, I think, is the biggest contributing factor. I think if we start to just include questions about visual hallucinations in our history or as part of the brief when we're just informing patients who are being diagnosed with sight loss conditions about Charles Bonnet syndrome, I think we'll enter into a lot more conversations and identify a lot more cases. We know that this is a condition that affects the elderly predominantly, and that's because sight loss conditions are more prevalent in the elderly, like glaucoma and age-related macular degeneration and diabetes. And so I just think we need to be sharing the condition with more families and more patients and just normalizing this. The second reason is, as I mentioned, I don't think children want to talk about it or even know to talk about this. And that's why communication is so important, not just between doctors and patients, but with the orthoptists that are measuring children's vision, the opticians in the high street, optometrists seeing patients in clinic, junior doctors, consultants, social workers, qualified teachers of the visually impaired, family support services. The more we talk about this, the more everyone will realise that this is a complication of sight loss and nothing else to be worried or anxious about. Interestingly, from our studies, we did notice that a large proportion of children who developed Charles Bonnet Syndrome actually had an inherited eye condition caused by changes in their genes. And so what I would just like to say is, please everyone, keep raising awareness of this condition. For those of you watching, there are various support groups and resources. A great resource for patients with inherited eye conditions is a website called gene.vision. And Esme's Umbrella is an amazing charity that will reach out and give you the support and point you in the right direction if you need it. Thank you so much, and over back to you, Judith.
Living with Charles Bonnet Syndrome is not at all easy, and I'm going to introduce you now to Nina Chesworth. Nina lives with CBS 24 hours a day, and she will explain to you just what it's like. Nina.
Hi, my name's Nina Chesworth, and I want to share with you today a little bit about my experience with Charles Bonnet Syndrome. My sight condition started when I was 2 years old after catching the flu virus, which then developed into different kind of eye problems. Having several surgeries to try and correct the sight. Some were successful, some weren't. My levels of vision varied, but I never experienced Charles Bonnet Syndrome. I never heard of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Then 13 years ago, I lost my right eye in an accident. 3 years ago, I lost the retina in my left eye, which then caused Charles Bonnet Syndrome to be triggered. I was in recovery after the surgery to the left eye, where they managed to save my eye, but not my sight, unfortunately. And I was lying there, and all I started to see was red and blue kind of mist. And I just assumed that they'd managed to save some of my sight. My husband and my mum ran off and got the doctor. He came back and he said, "No, I can reassure you, we've not saved your sight. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." There was, again, still no mention of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So we went home. 4 or 5 weeks later, the colours had started to develop into shapes. More colours had joined them. The shapes began to form faces, and not only like human faces, but they were kind of cartoon characters, and they had no eyes in the sockets and blood dripping down the cheeks, and they just floated in front of my face. I kept all this to myself. I didn't tell anybody because I was really worried that they would just assume that I was having a nervous breakdown or I was struggling to come to terms with my sight loss, and I was really worried that they'd think I was going mad. And it got to that point where I just had to tell someone because I was on my own more in the house because my son had gone back to school, my husband back to work, and the images were just getting worse, I think because I was alone so much. I shared with them what I was seeing, and to my surprise they were as understanding as they could be. They were a little taken aback by it, so we just went into full research mode. We came across Esme's Umbrella, and that's when I got in touch with Judith Potts, and she was so lovely, understanding, and straight away explained what Charles Bonnet Syndrome was, told me that it seemed very likely that that's what I had, and invited me along to her York Patient Support Day. There we met Dominic ffytche, I met Judith in person. We also met other people with the condition, and I can't tell you how much of a relief it was just to speak to others that were going through the same thing I was. Also to get a diagnosis and to be told that this is an actual condition and it's not just my mind playing tricks on me like that doctor in the hospital told me. It was so good to know that I wasn't alone. My experiences of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, they're different to the stories that I've heard from other people. With me, they are constantly 24 hours a day from when I wake to when I go to sleep. I see lots of colour, shapes, I see animals. There could be a tiger just kind of sat floating in front of me. Faces that will appear and then disappear, kind of in a cloud of smoke. My hallucinations follow me wherever I move. If I move my eyes left to right, they follow me, the patterns stay with me. They also can get in the way sometimes because I have no vision at all. If the hallucinations are quite bad and they're in my way and they distract me from what I'm doing, and then that can cause accidents. I've walked into walls, I've fell down the stairs because of them, because a tiger may suddenly appear, and because my concentration is needed, because I don't have that vision, it startles me and it can cause accidents. I've had Charles Bonnet Syndrome now for 3 years, and I've come across lots of different coping mechanisms, some through Esme's umbrella, some of my own that I've come across. The ones that have worked for me are meditation and yoga and ginger. It doesn't make them go away, it just reduces the intensity of the hallucination. Other people have told me that eye movement, leaving the room, coming back into the room, turning the lights on and off, different things help different people. I think it's a case of experimenting with the different coping mechanisms and seeing what works best for you. Charles Bonnet Syndrome has really impacted my life. I didn't really expect it to. I thought sight loss would be harder. There are so many people in the UK and worldwide that have the condition that might not even know they have it. I hope this video can help people and give information to those who need it. There is so much more research to do and support to be given out there to people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome.
Thank you very much, Nina. Now, Nina talked about support, and this is incredibly important. For centuries, since 1760, when Charles Bonnet first documented what was happening to his grandfather, there has been no support at all. But now we have Esme's Friends groups, which are conducted on the telephone, online, face-to-face, and sometimes hybrid. These allow people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome to come together, to exchange their experience, because it's different for everyone, and to find coping strategies just to help them through. These strategies can be found on my website, along with all sorts of other information. Please visit www.charlesbonnetsyndrome.uk. That's spelt CharlesBonnetSyndrome.uk. It's very sad to think that for so long people were too afraid that they were developing a mental health condition to tell anybody. We now know that if someone whose sight is diminishing receives a warning that Charles Bonnet Syndrome might appear, they can then recognize that first hallucination for what it is and not think that they are developing a mental health condition. The outcome is so much better. Talking to others who have the same condition is hugely helpful. So we have the Esme's Friends groups, we have counsellors. Retina UK has a buddy scheme, and the Macular Society offers counselling. So there is help out there. At the moment, that's about it, but there is research which has begun at various universities, including Oxford, and we hope that once we know a little bit more about the condition, we will be able to find better ways to support people and a proper pathway for diagnosis, treatment, and support. When I launched Esme's Umbrella, one of my aims was to persuade the World Health Organization that this condition should be noted not just as a side effect of sight loss, but as a condition in its own right. And I'm very happy to say that with the help of Professor Andrew Dick here in the UK and Dr. August Kohlenbrander in the USA, we have achieved that. So now Charles Bonnet Syndrome has its own coding in the World Health Organization's taxonomy of diseases and conditions called ICD-11. For the Retina UK helpline, call 0300 111 4000. To contact the Macular Society, dial 0300 30 30 111.